Cases of child abuse in schools have once again come to the forefront, reigniting conversations around the safety of children, both in society and at schools. Many child protection groups are now calling for the South African Sex Offenders Register to become public in order to protect children from predators. To discuss this further, I am joined by Lamprecht, who is a supervisor and child safety consultant at Women and Men Against Child Abuse. Luke, good to have you on the program this afternoon. Firstly, what is the current status? Sure. What is the current status of South Africa's Sex Offenders Register, and how does it impact cases like the one involving Richard Danhauser?
So the first thing to understand is that the Sex Offender Register is only one component of the register system. So in order to end up on the Sex Offenders Register, you need to be convicted of a sexual offence against a child, a person with a disability, or a vulnerable person. So it's a very specific register, and if you did a criminal check, you would find the same kind of information. There's a second level of register, which is called the Child Protection Register, and that's run by the Department of Social Development rather than Justice. And that particular register is a register of people unsuitable to work with children. So, for example, if you are found guilty in a SACE hearing or in a disciplinary hearing or a children's court or maybe an harassment hearing, application can be made for you to end up on that register. So it's far broader than people who are convicted of sexual offences, because Mr. Danhauser would not have appeared on the Sexual Offenders Register. However, if the school had followed the correct disciplinary procedures, he would indeed have been on the Child Protection Register.
But can you explain the significance of making the Sex Offenders Register public? What are the potential benefits of doing this, but also the challenges that it presents for child safety?
Right. So there's been a lot of arguments against making the register public. For example, it will encourage vigilantes to go out and, attack potential pedophiles. We have not found that to be the case, because if you think just about the media, and I mean, you mentioned Mr. Danhauser now in particular, we regularly publish the details of people who are charged with, pled to, and have been found guilty of sexual offences. It's done regularly. And I don't know of any vigilante kind of attacks. On the flip side, the reason that there would be a value in making it public is that there is a level at which, for example, myself as a parent or a grandparent, I employ somebody to, let's say, teach my child piano. Now, the way the law currently works is that you have to employ a person in order to check them against the registers. In other words, it's an employer-employee relationship. And I mean, my opinion is that if I want to employ you to teach my child piano or give my child private dancing lessons or whatever, I should be able to access that register as a parent, because I am in fact in an employer-employee relationship, and it should be accessible to me.
But how does the lack of a public register affect the ability of schools and even other institutions to screen individuals who work closely with children?
Okay, so since 2015, in order for you to work with a child, you must have had, at least for people my age in their sort of mid-50s, at least one criminal check, because that will tell you if I've committed offences prior to the new legislation. So that's the first thing, and that's something you should have on your CV, and you should present to the people who are employing you. Secondly, if I employ anybody at the moment, I want them to have on their CV, because as part of being employed, the fact that they are not on the Sex Offenders Register and that they're not on the Child Protection Register. And if that status changes, that they need to inform me as the person who employs them. So the whole idea of employing people should be the fact that there needs to be at least on your CV, since 2015, frankly, and we won't employ people otherwise, on your CV, the fact that you're cleared against all of those registers. There is a duty on the schools to check, for example, in sort of the Danhauser case where he was, resigned under investigation. I think there was a whole HR problem there. But that if you phone that person at the school where he left for a reference, they should be honest with you, because the reference checks are as important as the register.
But let's add to that. Are there other measures that are currently in place to prevent individuals with a history of sexual misconduct from actually working in positions of trust with children? And are these measures even sufficient, according to you?
Okay. So the measures are definitely in place. We have, as I say, since 2015, we have a sex offenders register, we have a child protection register, we have and the child protection register is a register of people unsuitable to work with children. It does all exist. The problem is as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the problem is access, because there's always this big sort of balance in our country between someone's right to privacy and the right to the protection of children. Now, I mean, at Women and Men Against Child Abuse, for us, our duty of care as adults always outweighs the right to privacy of someone who has committed an offence. And obviously, you know, for us, the protection of children is greater than the privacy of the individual. So what we are saying is that the measures are in place, but I don't think the measures are adequately used. And one of the reasons we constantly get as to why the measures aren't used is that the process is cumbersome. The response time is extremely slow in terms of social development and whether someone's on the register. And as a result, you cannot deny someone their right to employment because there is a lag in social development replying to the register, which is why if it was a public document, you know, people, you know, like, for example, in order to know if someone is registered as a doctor, you can go to the HPCSA website. To know if someone's registered as a teacher, you can go to the SACE website and you can check if they are registered. Now, that's a very proactive system to say that you have the relevant qualifications to work with children. Why does the same not hold true for people who cannot work with children? That there should be a register that can be accessed to equally say, you know, you have committed some level of offence that has excluded you from working with children. Doesn't mean you can't work somewhere else. It's not denying your right to employment, but it's denying you access to people you have previously hurt.
But we mentioned the Richard Downhauser case, but it's not the only one. I mean, in light of recent controversies, what steps can be taken in your view, Luke, to improve transparency, but also accountability, especially in the hiring and screening process for roles involving children?
So I think it goes back one step. So I think, if you take a multitude of these cases, I mean, if you take the one that is happening in the private boys' schools, you take the Downhauser case, I mean, I can mention multiple of them.
Sure.
The problem starts with what the schools do when the suspicion of abuse or grooming arises. Now, what should happen is that those people, like Mr. Downhauser or whoever else, we can mention, that they are given a charge sheet to say, this is what you have been accused of. In terms of the labour legislation, you know, it's not about anybody's rights being violated.
Right.
And then obviously the procedural and substantive issues of the law must be followed. The problem that we're having at the moment, and Mr. Downhauser and many others are an example of this, is they call these people in and have an informal discussion with them about the rumours or the suspicions. And the schools don't want to do anything because they don't have evidence, but they haven't run any form of hearing. So the net result is those people resign. And then the schools say, well, I now have no jurisdiction because this person is no longer employed by me. And as a result, I can do nothing. Now, that's also not true because they should be referring it to SACE, or the South African Council for Educators, so that SACE can have a hearing to see if that behaviour was professional or not. Now, they don't do that either. So the net result is that what happens is these people who would have ended up on the Child Protection Register, had they been found guilty in a SACE hearing or a disciplinary hearing, they would be on the register. When we access the register, they cannot be employed. Plus, anybody who's employed, we need to ask them and say, have you been convicted of anything in any of these proceedings that will exclude you from working with children? So it's part of the interview process. And then finally, when we phone those schools for references to say, you know, is this a guy we should employ? The person on the other side should say, no, that person was under investigation for grooming or was found guilty, or when they were confronted, they resigned under suspicion, because, you know, is that person's right to employment going to supersede children's right to protection?
Yeah. And as we wrap up our conversation, how does the South African legal framework indeed address the issue, especially of past misconducts by individuals in sensitive positions? And what improvements are needed in your view?
Okay. So look, I think our law is entirely sufficient. I think that there's nothing else that needs to be changed in terms of our law. I think the interpretation of the law, for example, that parents are allowed access to the register as a public document to see if someone is registered as a person unsuitable to work with children, would be a valuable addition, because we employ individuals to work with our children all the time. And then, very importantly, the response time of the departments and the integrity of the information on those registers and the referrals to those registers need to be followed without any, as they say, fear or favor, so that if a person is found guilty of such a transgression, that they cannot work with children. Doesn't mean they cannot work, but they've excluded themselves from working with children. And what people must understand in conclusion is that there is a level where you can apply for your name to be taken off the register once it's on it, provided you have, undergone certain therapies and certain, so it's not that it's a life sentence, which is the other argument that sort of the more human rights activists have in. This is now a life sentence, this person has served their time or they've been punished, you can't keep punishing them. It should be their duty to get them off the register, their duty to get themselves off the register. And I think that would be I think that would be a very welcome addition to the process.
And finally, what role do organizations like Women and Men Against Child Abuse play in indeed advocating for better protections and registers for sex offenders?
Right. So one of the things we do actually very interestingly is we use you as the media. So we encourage the media to be present during these cases, because what you must understand is Google is a far, far more potent register than any register on earth. So if you search a person's name, Google is who you say they are. Now, if the media cover, which is what we do, we have lots of media appearances, press releases, etc. If the media cover our cases and actually, once someone has pled, start naming them, once they are convicted, start naming them, when that person is Googled, because when I employ people now, I Google them and I Google their social media statuses and handles, etc., because I want to see how they represent themselves in the world. So we use mainly the media to cover the courts to do that. And then in the background, all of the things I've said, sort of advocating for policy and legislative change, which unfortunately is a slow process.
Luke, thank you so much for your time and providing valuable insights into the challenges, but also the developments surrounding South Africa's sex offenders register.